And I'm going to be sharing a little bit about the TRUE initiative, or the Real Urban Emissions Initiative, and sharing how we use real-world emissions data to help smarter transportation policies. So as Rachel mentioned, 10 years ago, Dieselgate scandal exposed that diesel cars in the US and the EU were emitting well above the emissions limits. ICCT researchers found that some vehicles showed up to 35 times higher NOx than the emissions limit. And this has a substantial air quality impact on particularly cities. And the recent study quantified it at the public health consequences at $1.2 trillion. So this kind of led to the founding of the TRUE initiative to measure vehicles and to see what they're actually emitting on the road. A TRUE study found that this problem among diesel vehicles was widespread across nearly all diesel manufacturers. And the TRUE initiative decided to work in cities to help clean up urban air pollution. And though Dieselgate was 10 years ago, today there's around 16 million vehicles that remain on the road in the EU and UK that show suspicious emissions. So even though the cars have gotten cleaner, a lot of these vehicles continue to operate on the road today. So the TRUE initiative is a partnership between the ICCT and FIA Foundation, and it was launched 8 years ago to help cities tackle urban air quality and to help promote climate policies and to help use independent real-world data about what cars are actually emitting on the road to help guide these policies to focus in on identifying and addressing the highest emitting vehicles. A lot of the early TRUE work was focused in Europe, particularly around this issue of diesel cars, with early work in London and Paris, particularly to help city policies like low emission zones. They were really aiming to clean up the dirtiest vehicles, to address this issue of high polluting diesel vehicles. Since then, TRUE has expanded to around 20 different cities, 5 different continents, including work here in the US, in Latin America, Jakarta, Kampala, and several other cities. So through this work, we've seen a couple trends emerge of policies and strategies that are that kind of occur across different regions. One of those being cleaning up high usage fleets. So these are vehicles that travel on average more miles per year, so that can be taxis or commercial vehicles. And this is a really important segment to focus on because they experience emissions deterioration. So since they're driving more miles each year, the emissions control systems degrade over time, which leads to higher emissions and more air pollution. They're also traveling more miles per year, so they contribute more to air pollution for that reason as well. So in Delhi, Gurugram, in India, the local policies incentivize compressed natural gas over diesel based on the assumption that it's a cleaner fuel, but it will lead to less air pollution. Testing that TRUE did revealed that these vehicles that are mostly powered by CNG actually show very high NOx emissions, around 2.4 to 5 times higher than passenger vehicles. This is among taxis and light good vehicles, so small commercial trucks. And they also emitted well above the emissions limit. So this real-world data helps evaluate this policy of CNG, prioritizing CNG and seeing how well it's working, and help providing evidence that it may not be the best policy for trying to address air pollution. In Mexico City, our study found that taxis were one of the highest emitting vehicle groups. And when we dug into the data a little bit more, we found that one model in particular was really driving this. And it was the Nissan Tsuru, which made up around 50% of the taxi fleet and emitted up to 10 times higher emissions compared to passenger vehicles on average. And this vehicle had already been kind of begun to be phased out over time. It had been pulled off the market due to safety concerns, but many of the vehicles still remain on the road. It was a very popular taxi choice. So the Mexico City government had already been investing in replacing these with newer vehicles, but this evidence really provides additional reason to replace these vehicles with newer, cleaner alternatives for the purpose of addressing urban air pollution. So for both of these, the kind of important strategy is to accelerate electrification, and that can be done through scrappage and rebate programs, so offering the vehicle owners money to replace their older vehicles with newer, cleaner alternatives, or sales mandates or other mechanisms to increase electrification. Another common thing that we see is the need to improve inspection and maintenance. So our testing in Kampala revealed that over half of gasoline passenger cars showed levels of NOx emissions that were consistent with pre-Euro standards. So that indicates that their emission control systems are not operating, so they're either completely malfunctioning or removed entirely. There was also a lot of minibuses in particular that showed visible black smoke, which is an indication of black carbon emissions. And this is a pollutant that's not only very bad for health, but it is also a major climate pollutant. And the study quantified that minibuses, the black carbon emissions had 7 times the impact on climate compared to the CO2 emissions. So it's a very important pollutant to target for both climate and health reasons. And it's also very easy to identify because of the visible black smoke. But inspection and maintenance programs, local partners helped identify that one major issue was that mechanics are not necessarily trained or don't have the resources to operate on newer vehicles with more some of these emission control systems. So policies to address this or improve inspection and maintenance programs needed to really help address this gap. In Canada, where there's a very different vehicle fleet, where vehicles are comparatively newer and have the newest emission control systems, we still see some parallels where in Alberta we found that testing revealed that trucks showed widespread evidence of tampering or malfunctions of emission control systems. So around 38% of certain vehicle groups showed evidence of this, and this is widely known to be a problem amongst trucking groups and air quality groups that truck owners or fleet owners are disabling their emission control systems, which leads to very high levels of NOx emissions. And so currently Alberta does not have any inspection and maintenance program, so although that might not be a legal thing to do, it's also, there's no mechanism for enforcement. This paper, putting numbers to this, really helps support policies and support the work that local groups are doing to help implement an inspection and maintenance program. Our work in the US is often very focused around public health and equity. So recent work from a few years ago in New York City looked at the impact of diesel trucks on local air quality and found that people of color are disproportionately exposed to diesel particulate matter from diesel trucks. And that it's particularly concentrated around high traffic roadways and industrial areas. And this work has supported more recent policies and programs that New York has been working on to clean up freight emissions. And most recently with the policy that New York is working to implement called the indirect source rule, which really targets warehouses and pollution associated with warehouses. So all the trucks doing deliveries in often what are overburdened neighborhoods with high levels of air pollution, and to implement a policy to really help address this issue. In Seattle, we are about to release an analysis on drayage trucks and looking at the impact of drayage truck emissions on local communities. We're very fortunate to partner with the Wamish River Community Coalition, and we're excited to have Paulina, the executive director, speak later on our panel. And work there helped put some numbers to the issue of drayage truck emissions. And it had been known in the community that trucks are often idling outside of neighborhoods, outside of schools. And our analysis found that the neighborhoods with the highest level of idling had on average around 50% higher rates of premature death. So showing that this is a health equity issue and that cleaning up these trucks and moving to cleaner trucks is very important for the purpose of addressing this disparity. And there's work currently ongoing around electrifying drayage trucks. It's a segment that is a good target for electrification because they tend to travel shorter distances, and particularly these trucks that are operating in the Duwamish Valley, which is an overburdened community, are a major target for electrification to help address the air quality issues. So with both of these, the strategy is kind of to focus on policies that address the emission hotspots or help reduce the emissions in the most polluted areas, and that can be done by targeting the ports or warehouses or other industrial areas. So these are some examples of how TRUE uses data to help support cities to implement policies improving air quality and helping meet climate goals. And that's done by two main strategies of one, cleaning up the vehicles that are already on the road today, so identifying the dirtiest vehicles and working to replace those with cleaner alternatives. And then the second being for the newer vehicles to really work to transition to zero emission fleets or transition to alternative forms of mobility. Some of the policy tools that I highlighted include inspection and maintenance programs, or indirect source rules, clean air zones, scrappage and rebate programs, and investment in zero emission transit are also tools, among others, that TRUE will highlight as solutions that cities can look to solve urban air quality issues. So I'll stop there, and yeah, looking forward to hearing from our panelists next.
Thank you so much, first of all, to our event host, ITTP, ICCT, and Crux Alliance for convening this great event and panel today. Really happy to be here. My name is Catherine Ittner, and I'm a Senior Manager of Zero Emission Freight with C40 Cities. So for anyone who's not familiar with C40, we are a network of nearly 100 cities and mayors around the world committed to climate action. And we provide support to our cities through largely peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, but also technical assistance projects, city business collaboration, convenings, and we work a lot with ICCT and alongside IDTP on providing that support to our cities. So very excited to be here, and I wanted to share a bit just about, prior to my current role, I actually worked on an air quality monitoring project in London, where we looked at the highest contributors to the biggest air pollutants in the city. And that was really eye-opening for me in terms of thinking about transport from both a climate emissions and air quality and health perspective, and how we need to be thinking about both of these things together. Electrification of vehicles is obviously a huge part of the conversation, and we need that for, as Michelle was saying, the high usage vehicles, the long term we know we're still going to need vehicles, but we also need to be thinking about load shift and getting people out of personal vehicles and onto public transit, bicycles, and at C40 we think a lot about just trying to create cities where people actually want to live and work and spend time, and it's a healthy place to raise families. So I'm about to hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. And there will be a little bit of time for questions at the end. So if you have a question, I think there's a Slido app that people can use. So you can join the conversation there. But before we do that, I wanted to share just one quick thing. So at C40, as I mentioned, we do peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. I just returned from a workshop that we had where we brought together 11 US cities to talk about very similar topics to what we're talking about today. And it made me hopeful because despite the current political situation in our country, there's still a lot of progress that's happening, and there's still a lot of determination to move things forward on sustainable mobility. And one thing that I'm particularly excited about, I work on freight, goods movement within cities, is the advancement of cargo bikes, or e-quads. And actually, I saw one on the street just outside of the hotel as I was walking in. I don't know if anyone else saw it, but so e-quad vehicles that are increasing on our streets and are a great alternative to trucks, especially in areas where lots of people work, where they're being exposed to the truck pollution. And actually Seattle, we've been working with them on developing a commercial cargo bike program, and I think today officially it's being adopted by City Council, so this is hopefully we can see more of this across the country. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand it, I've got one other microphone, but I'll hand to Paulina first. If you could say your name, organization, and just a few bits of information about your role.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and very, very grateful to be here this morning with you all. My name is Paulina Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of a small but mighty environmental justice organization in the Seattle area called the Duwamish River Community Coalition. Thanks, Michelle, for mentioning it through your presentation. We are an organization in existence for more than 23 years, and we've been working on environmental justice issues in our community of the Duwamish Valley. People think of Seattle as a very progressive, beautiful, green city, but there are parts that are not this way, and so I'm very grateful with partnerships that we have with ICCT, with Moving Forward Network, where we are trying to bring policy and actions to change the actual data that shows still 13 years of life expectancy difference between my neighborhood and a neighborhood 10 miles away from in Seattle area. So thanks for having us.
Hi, good morning. Just also share appreciation for being here and being on this panel. I'm Molly Greenberg. I'm the campaign director with the Moving Forward Network. And so I think rather than go into too much detail for who I am, but for Moving Forward Network, for those who don't know, we're very focused on organizing around the issues that are caused by the freight transportation system. So trucks are part of that, but we know that if we were to clean up trucks, there's still rail, there's still ships, there's cargo handling equipment, there's a lot of things that cause injustice in very particular communities, and the communities that are living closest to those sources of pollution. Frontline and fence line communities are here, environmental justice communities. And so we work with about 50 member organizations, including a few environmental organizations and academics, but primarily led by frontline and fence line communities from across this country, all fighting to stop the pollution that's impacting their communities and fighting for zero emissions. And when we say that these are the communities, you'll hear more about some of these policies, right? Who started ISRs. They know indirect source rules because they're the ones who were there writing it. Cumulative impacts policies, you'll hear more about, from local truck counts to data collection to data analysis, and then even to national of the first ever zero emission and freight fact sheet that was passed by the Biden administration, really moving freight and zero emissions both from that local to the national. So it's really great to be here talking about cities and talking about how we can continue to collaborate. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Isabella Brown. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I oversee a lot of our transportation-related projects. And for those of you that don't know, our office's job is, really to make sure that New York City gets to its goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, and to make sure that we are really acknowledging and working towards, remedying areas where historically disadvantaged communities have been disproportionately overburdened by pollution and greenhouse gas, point sources. Thank you so much for having me.
My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorsheim. I'm a physician, boarded in internal and preventive medicine. I spent 2 years working at the health department here in New York City, and now I work at NYU Bellevue, where I work clinically almost exclusively with patients who have asthma and other conditions that are affected by environmental exposures. And I teach and do research on environmental related issues, specifically air pollution and microplastics.
Hey, thank you all. So I'm going to start with a question for the whole group, and then I've got individual questions. So the first question for everyone is, what are 1 to 2 policies or solutions that you think have proven effective in improving air quality in urban neighborhoods, especially those historically impacted by air pollution? Does anyone want to kick us off?
Oh, go on.
Oh,
no. Yeah, I mean, 1 to 2, I think in New York City specifically, this is outside of the transportation sector, but clean heat in New York City has been one of the most effective, both greenhouse gas and pollution reduction initiatives that we've seen in the city. It is, over a decade in implementation. And for those of you that don't know, New York City Clean Heat is really about, I'm just going to put this down, phasing out of the dirtier fossil fuels in our residential buildings, and some of those really high emitting, high pollution sources, phasing them out of our buildings and making sure that our buildings are using cleaner fuels. So I think that's one policy that's been really effective. And then the second, of course, many people here have mentioned the New York City indirect source rule. This was really inspired by what we saw happening in California. And a really great way of, also using, clean air regulation and policies to really give municipalities, districts, the ability to regulate emissions associated with the activities of warehouses, and really to regulate the warehouse for all of the transportation emissions that result from its operations. So this has happened in California with the great help of C40, and honestly a lot of people in this room. New York City recently introduced a bill to develop a indirect source rule in New York City. It is going through the kind of environmental review process right now, but I think one of the things that is most inspiring is, like you said, a lot of this came out of great community action, community advocacy, a lot of the communities on the ground doing the work, showing the city really where they needed the city to step up, and great inspiring partners across on the West Coast, and really bringing together a great group of folks to find a new way to regulate transportation emissions in the city, which can be really hard if you're a municipality. And so similar to Clean Heat, New York City Department of Environmental Protection is able to kind of take on and do that rulemaking, and really regulate in a way that hopefully creates similar emission reduction. So we're really excited about that, and hope to see that rolling out in the next few years.
I just want to say something really quick on that. Just on the indirect source rule, so we actually have a guide that we've been working on based on the experience in New York City of developing policy alongside obviously the city, Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, and TYLN. And that's up now on our Knowledge Hub. So check out C40's Knowledge Hub if you're interested in learning more about, you are a city, state, region advocacy group that's interested in how would you actually go about developing an indirect source rule. And now I'll hand it over to Tom.
Thank you. One legislation I think will work best is all legislation driven by community experience, living experience. I think, we all communities, we are impacted the same way, but we all have different realities. So we have to acknowledge that there's no community that, fits all in the same solution. However, I do think there have been wonderful legislation move that has been supporting, and I'm going to refer to, for example, in Washington State, we moved the HEAL Act, which first acknowledges environmental justice in communities. That was hard for us in Washington State to think that, for a green state that had been protecting the environment for the longest time, but really wasn't protective of healthy standards. So for us, it was very important to move forward and have state agencies support communities that have been impacted directly by diesel pollution, by asthma, by all these different sources of pollution that brings the everyday. That has bring also some of the funding to communities, continue doing, for example, air monitoring that is more localized. We had this study that we were actually driven by our youth, local youth. It's called the Duane Beach Valley Youth Corps, one of our programs. And they were themselves determining, well, we were using moss as a bioindicator of pollution. So the youth was out in the community, and they know exactly when they wanted to test what Moss was saying. And with that Moss, we were exactly determining, and we corroborated with other scientists. Oh, wow, so here's exactly where the youth wanted to do the testing for these moss. We're indicating high rates of PM 2.5 and PM 10, heavy metals, lead, cadmium, and arsenic. So when I said, like we want all this legislation to be listening to communities, because I think we do have the built-in knowledge with ourselves, with the youth, having the resources to do it and involving them through the legislation and advocacy, that has really worked for us.
I can't really add much more, but I will say, when we think about indirect source rules, right, we know from the amazing work that the communities in California have fought for years, the fight's not over. And so indirect source rules for warehouses is one piece of the puzzle. There's a ports indirect source rule. There was a rail and locomotive effort. So these are policies that were born by communities who were impacted by freight, knowing that something needed to change and fighting for it and defending. And I think that's the other piece we want to elevate from kind of what Paulina said. So when communities are part of the process, not the end result, part of the process is grounded in their needs and their expertise, you end up with policies to fight for. And that's what sustains, and that's what actually becomes effective. And so I think it's the task for myself as a campaign director, to any other advocate in this room, to really think about our roles and how we can move and amplify those efforts. Because while we're feeling like there's a lot of loss, this is coming off of decades of communities going, freight's a problem, diesel's a problem, and everyone's saying, we can't do anything about it, this is just what exists. So zero emissions as being something that felt like a fairy tale. And now we actually have technology, and now we continue to push forward, and now we continue to innovate, and that's because we learn from those who've always had to be the innovators.
So I'm not really a policy person, so I can't speak to the most specific examples in New York City. I do know about 15 years ago, there was a local law that was enacted largely in response to symptoms that patients and populations were reporting with regard to their sinuses that outlawed high sulfur heating oil. And that was one of the major successes in New York City with removing sulfur dioxide from the air. As many of you are aware, the criteria pollutants affect the human body differently depending on how water soluble they are. And so the sulfur dioxides are really water soluble, and they sort of affect the upper respiratory tract compared to the NOxes and your other criteria pollutants, which can make their way a little bit further down into the lower respiratory tract. What I did want to say is that policy in general has been shown to be tremendously effective with regard to patient care and patient outcomes. About 15 years ago, we had the Green NYC initiative, which was tremendously successful in reducing criteria pollutants at a citywide level by at least about 30%. SO2 went down by about 95%. And we did see at a population level that ER visits and hospitalizations for asthma and cardiovascular disease dropped by about 50%. So tremendously effective with regard to the health of the population.
You let you in consent. Oh yeah, but
Yeah.
I want to finish.
Yeah, so I think that was really great to hear about how policy that is rooted in community experience can lead to more effective outcomes, but also, Molly, you made a point of it creates something that people are ready to defend. So you also have the buy-in and the support that will allow it to get over the finish line. So with that in mind, Molly, I'm curious what gaps you see in community-based frontline organizing in this sector, and what should decision makers do to better engage communities? And anyone can jump in after Molly.
I think, and we've seen certainly that there's a big disconnect between decision makers, policy makers, and people, and be it community, be it frontline, fence line, but just people in general. That there's been a lot of organizing efforts to really engage the decision maker, but not make sure that the decision maker is engaging the people in the community. We're not even directing our resources well enough to make sure that the community is informed of what's going on, that there's just been a shift. And so I think one piece is actually
in some ways, the call to action for the decision makers is always remember that you're there, you're supposed to be representing people in your communities, and you should be meeting them where they're at, and that should be the first priority. But the call to action, as an organizer, I love a good call to action, is really for the folks also in the room who aren't politicians, right? Who work for organizations, who work for academic institutions. Think about how many meetings you've had with a legislator, with the Department of Environmental Protection, with a regulator in the past week. And then think about who was in the room with you. And think about who wasn't in the room with you. And I'll say, for at least for MFN, when we show up to a meeting, we never show, it's never just me. That's not the point. The point is that not only are we centering our frontline and fence line communities and our community organizations like Duwamish River Community Coalition, but that we also bring in our academic partners and that they're there supporting. They're not there leading, they're there supporting and amplifying and echoing and bringing their expertise and their knowledge to make sure that we're continuing that process. And so I think the gap is something that we've seen get wider, and I think we also have some really great people in the room who can help make it a much smaller gap. And really just think about your meetings even next week. Who are you bringing into those meetings? How are you engaging them? How are we creating tools and resources so that organizations can also make sure that they're able to inform their community so that we're continuing the process? We have to really be thinking a lot more expansive, and I'm very excited to be able to be here with you all to do so.
Yeah. I just wanted to add a few thoughts on what Molly well described. There is always going to be the possibility for groups like organizations like ours to bring community at the center. So when we think about the gaps, of course, is resources. One thing is, of course, to move legislation, which is so important, but also to increase the community capacity of those of the communities that are being centered. So forming, community action teams, advocacy teams. We have in our strategy for the Clean Air program, which our Clean Air manager is here, Mia Ayala Marshall, if you want to connect. We do have a way of engaging with community-centered voices on a monthly basis to check with them to make sure that we are moving at the same pace as advocacy legislation is moving at constantly. It takes energy and resources, but it's totally worth it because we always hear more and more information from them that help us design any programmatic things that we're doing to advance policy.
Estella, do you have something to add?
Yeah.
Just, I think a reminder for myself and also for other folks in the government position, we often, I think sometimes will approach policy saying, especially zero emission policy saying like, is the technology ready? Is the technology there? Okay, now we can build out a policy. Like, is it even feasible? And absolutely feasibility is a critical piece of that. But I also think understanding that resources towards research and development geared towards wherever we as a city or other industries point them towards, I think is an important piece. Like sometimes the technology is ready in those places because they think that's where the market wants to go. And, part of the job of the, offices like ours and other, nonprofits is to say, this is what the community is looking for. We need to tell, the industry to meet the community there. And I think that's a really critical shift instead of saying, like with indirect source rule, like, well, a zero emission truck doesn't exist. It will exist if we, convey that is a priority, especially for big industries, big cities, things like that.
So one of the things that I think is often missing from conversations that require engagement from stakeholders from a variety of backgrounds is the economic impacts of air pollution. And so somebody who might not be 100% motivated by issues of health or social justice might be interested in understanding what the tremendous impacts are on the local economy and citywide economy. So for example, air pollution, the health effects of air pollution, and the premature mortality specifically from air pollution costs at a global level trillions of dollars, about $9 trillion each year. At the national level, hundreds of billions of dollars, and even in New York City, tens of billions of dollars each year. And so from that perspective, there should be tremendous incentive for stakeholders at each level to be really motivated to try to minimize criteria as much as possible to optimize the health of the population.
Yes, thank you. I think that's an important point for the more business-minded folks who are looking for the business case, the industry is also there. And I want to stick with you for a minute, Dr. Florsheim. If you could share a little bit more about what you see as a public health practitioner. How can air quality policies directly or indirectly benefit patients?
So I already touched on a little bit what air pollution policy sort of universally in New York City did for patients at the population level over the last 15 years. But one of the things that's really important to remember is in New York City we have tremendous inequality with regard to air pollution exposure and air pollution outcomes. I work at Bellevue, and for those of you who don't live in New York City, we generally serve an underserved population, mostly people of color, a lot of immigrants, people who are struggling with regard to socioeconomic issues. And a lot of these patients develop asthma and have very severe asthma, largely because of the locations in which they were born, where they live, and how they grow up. We have, again, probably half of this room is aware, or maybe half aren't, an area of the Bronx in New York City called Asthma Alley, which is tremendously affected by traffic pollution. Think about 30% of their residents have asthma. They have asthma hospitalizations and ER rates that are 20 times the rates that we see in other neighborhoods in New York City, and 3 times the national average. So when we talk about policy, and New York City has done, in my opinion, a tremendous job of addressing those inequalities. We see that not only are policies effective at improving the health of the population level, but specifically for these low resource communities who typically just don't have the resilience that other members of the population have.
Thank you. And I think that raises an important point of how data can help reveal those inequalities, and like the True Project to show where are the hotspots and linking that with public health data so that we can see is the real impact, the true impact of these emissions. So we are all here in New York City, so I'd like to hear a bit more from Isabella about the most effective policy levers in New York. You talked about clean heat, we talked about indirect source rules, but what else do you see happening in New York City, especially as congestion pricing and bus electrification are ramping up in the state? And are there any challenges that you foresee with scaling these?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, I think we have a lot of policies that are, just starting to get implemented, like congestion pricing. One other that has been really effective and, has gained a lot of momentum is our school bus electrification policy. We have about 10,000 school buses in the city, and they all need to be electric by 2035. So that's a pretty fast ramp up. And it's a pretty complex system when you think about how a municipality interacts with school bus companies, school bus depots throughout the city. I think it also gives us a lot of insight into some of the challenges and scaling that we may see with things like the indirect source rule and a lot of those heavy-duty fleets and really industrial areas where we need to start shifting over to zero emission. One of the reasons that scaling is tricky in the school bus electrification space, and I should mention we have about 500 buses coming down road to New York City. We've tripled our expected electric school bus fleet in the last year. So we've done a lot of momentum working with school bus companies that we contract with to really make sure, I'm so bad at this, to really make sure that we can start electrifying and meet that really ambitious goal of 10,000 electric school buses in the next year. It's also really important for places like the Bronx, because so many school bus depots are in the Bronx. So one of the things that we see a lot with scaling that is so hard is the infrastructure piece cannot be overestimated. For many of these depots, they are not ready to, for the amount of electrical demand that we're going to see from all of these, talk about school buses, but what we'll see with trucks, heavy duty trucks, in forts if we ever get to that place, the infrastructure needed, think about every single parking lot. It is not meant to be, use a ton of electricity. And so all of the electrical upgrades that go into that are things that we need to start thinking about kind of 10 years before we even, roll out that implementation. So I think infrastructure and, as we talk about community advocacy and those things, getting things started early and really having people invested, because the lead time is going to be a long time in terms of the infrastructure. And then the last piece, I'll switch back, is the workforce component. So, school bus companies in the city especially, I think, are at the forefront of this electrification we're going to see for a lot of heavy duty fleets. And, shifting a workforce over who traditionally used to, be mechanics for diesel engines, to a place where they are managing the charging, fixing electrical buses, even though they have less issues and less repairs. When that happens right now in New York City, the bus needs to get shipped out to California or Canada or wherever those manufacturers come from. So I think developing the workforce in the city and making sure we're bringing those folks along as we do this major transition is one of the most critical pieces that we're starting to think about in our office. And many of those heavy duty depots that we're seeing are starting to say we need an electrical engineer on site, and that is a huge shift from an operation that really has not done a lot of interaction with that kind of technology before. So infrastructure and workforce, I think, are those two big pieces we need to think about with scaling.
Thank you. And workforce development is a huge one for all of our cities. And just at our workshop, it came up quite a bit. And as we're saying, it's different needs, but it's also, there's difficulty in hiring. We talked a lot about the need to partner with local community colleges for programs. Phoenix was talking about that they've been working with a program that helps people coming out of prison to find work, where you get trained perhaps as like an electrician for vehicles. Yes, and actually C40, we put out a report earlier this year on good green jobs and electric freight, looking at all of these, the skills that will be needed and the gaps that are there. Certainly didn't find all the answers, but it's just going to become more and more of an issue, I think. Great, well in that case, we've been talking about the East Coast, so going back to the West Coast with Paulina. Could you share a little bit about some of the most urgent actions or policy shifts needed to secure long-term air quality improvements in the Duwamish Valley, and how can community-led organizations really drive the policy agenda?
Thank you. I look forward to reading the report. Well, I think I cannot say enough the importance of cumulative impacts legislation law. For the many places and research that we have done, yes, having federal legislation helps. Like clean air was very helpful, but yet it doesn't do a lot for communities that are impacted cumulatively by different things. So since we have the highest asthma hospitalization rates, but then we also have obesity in there, and we mix it with having the airports and freight and trains and all these things that really we haven't accounted for having results. When EPA is saying this is safe if you breathe up to this PM 2.5, and then we do our own research and we see, the World Health Organization, we're still 3 times higher of what the World Health Organization is telling us. So cleaner, really not very helpful, the Cleaner Act. So at the state level, that's when it's important to account, because we know exactly, and when we, at the beginning, when I started talking about communities know best, and there's no one thing that fits all, this is a way for community to give some of this self-determination of saying, we know what is killing us. We know what is bringing all these health inequities to the core, and this is what we want to change. So there is a very good example, if you are familiar with New Jersey, what they have done. We've been trying to pass it on to Washington. Twice we have failed by industries being the opposing. But I think we will continue hard. Most importantly, what we have seen is we cannot allow polluters to continue just paying the violations they're doing and continue to violate, and just because they can have the permit. So the permitting process is very important to cut it to the core. Root causes, if we're anything to remember today, is just cut, that's the root cause. Because polluters continue to pollute, and we cannot change, no matter how many things we have on top, if they continue to be allowed to pollute the way they do. So that's one, very important. The second one I would refer to is really the ports. Anybody from the ports here? We need to, they need to move faster. I think we have talked about we started talking 2050 first, and we were like, heck no, what 2050? What's the change here? So 2040 is what they're talking about, in the summer, 2035. But it's still, we still have idling happening. And with the report that we just did with ICCT, that is a consequence of us breathing this horrible air every time. Electrification is the right route for sure, but we need to move faster, and they need to have their acts in a row to really being stronger allies with the communities, how much they are impacting. 5,000 trucks are leaving the Port of Seattle, passing through my neighborhood. Imagine that, until we're like 25, okay? My kids have been born and raised, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how many of these years I kind of feel guilty of having them exposed to these. But still, there is a hope, and that hope is to bring accurate legislation, prohibit zones, do green zoning, no more idling. But it's so hard for them, they have so much ownership in lands, but yet they don't bring all these idling for prohibition to the court. So.
Yes, definitely ports, especially given all the communities living right next to ports and experiencing that air pollution. LA, the Port of LA and Long Beach has an interesting approach where they have introduced a clean truck fee. So if you're coming in, you're not in a clean truck, you pay. It's not that high, because it can't be too high or it would be illegal, but it's like $10 or $20 per container. And it's been generating millions of dollars that then goes toward clean truck incentives. And so it's just one way to kind of help speed up the electrification, because industry is saying, oh, we can't afford it. All right, well, we're going to provide some incentives to help you over.
Okay, this will be the final question for the group.
So I'm going to ask, with all of these points in mind, how do researchers, community groups, health professionals, policymakers, how do they collaborate better to inform these air quality regulations and strategies, and especially given our current political landscape?
I always like to think of kind of where we start, and so making sure to not go into a community with the solution. Don't come in with what you are hoping your research is going to get you to, what's the policy you're going to get to, what's the conclusion. One, it limits your research because you're never to think expansive, and the other is the community is actually your strongest tool to make sure that it's going to inform your research to where it can go. And so I think that's one piece. I also want to echo what was said, is never forget public health in any of these analyses on ports and freight that you're doing, because we know the data isn't really there, right? There's no good regulatory air monitoring. We can talk about LA and Long Beach having potentially one of the strongest. We also know that community track when those monitors go down. And there's nobody who's accounting
for what data is lost. So again, there's a lot that we don't know, and as research, I say this as also a PhD student, as researchers, we have a responsibility to remember the limitations. And if the goal of all of this is really about electrification and zero emissions, then we want to make sure that we're getting ourselves there. For MFN, we saw this when we were working with Department of Energy on the blueprint for rail, and they pulled out all of using some of their tools, but the top impacted rail locomotive sites were, and we said, this doesn't make sense. San Bernardino in California isn't there. Chicago isn't there. People, we know there's massive trains and freight. And then they added public health. And then they added the criteria that was things under like EJ screen and what we saw with the cumulative impacts federal tool. And all of a sudden it expanded what was possible and what was seen. And again, those are just really important when you look at the conclusion going, this doesn't make any sense. So how are we really thinking through? So just being there and being a resource, and also trying to make sure our research lasts, again, longer than just a researcher in the audience. So building the tools so that people take ownership and understanding, because they're not statistics, right? You can say 1 out of 4 kids have asthma. Now count 1 out of 4 in your row, and now you have asthma. It's your whole life. And so really trying to ground these things into what's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to that, market indication piece that I said before. We have been working on a, not so much transportation related project, but actually a project around street vendor electrification. We have been, this is from the ground up, we've been working with researchers, policy makers, academics, and really, I think seeing something, an idea like that, come from, the Street Vendor Project is a community-based organization in New York City who came to us and said, this is what our vendors want, this is what they need, because, standing for 12 hours a day next to a diesel generator and standing in a cart with a propane tank, over those fumes for 12 hours a day is not, the health and safety goals that we have for some of those workers. And I think working with them, pulling together researchers and academics, and I think that's really where we see telling the industry this is the market we want to go towards has been a critical piece for us to play, because CDOs don't have always that kind of power and that kind of voice to tell the market, this is actually where we want you to focus, even though it is not, the newest EV vehicle, it is a critical component for us. And I think, making sure everybody's on the same page, communicating the same things, and really, getting the data and making sure that the participants have access to that data and that it is open and accessible is a huge part of it as well. So we go out and we survey vendors in the city, and we make sure that we follow up and tell them, this is the data that we collected, this is what it says about your energy usage, even if we don't have a technological solution at the moment, making sure people own and have access to their own data is really important.
So many good points already covered here, but the only thing that I would add is posing your research question and framing your communications in a way that would be accessible, understandable, and interesting to multiple stakeholders at different levels. I could say, as a clinician who works with patients who've been affected by asthma and other issues that affect their health their entire lives, I spend a lot of time talking with patients about environmental issues, and I have to frame those environmental issues in terms of how it's affecting their disease. And sometimes, you come across patients and populations who should be really motivated to get involved and make certain changes, but because nobody's ever communicated with them in a way that makes the issue seem relevant to them, no action's ever been taken. And so I think trying to choose your research and choose your communication style in a way that people of all levels will be interested in it and be motivated to take action is important.
And last but not least, capacity building, funding. we are under attack. Nonprofits that exactly what we are doing, environmental justice, people of color, everything, all these words that are under attack. So it's an issue. We won't be able to do all these centering voices that are so important in the living experience, storytelling, if we don't go alongside with these communities and provide some resources and capacity building. So very important in order to continue including the collective and the moving forward.
Thank you. Really essential. Organizing doesn't just happen on its own.
Yes.
Hey, I think we will turn to audience questions now.
Hello, thanks. Hi everyone, my name is Ian Tafoya. I'm with an organization called Green Latinos, organizing environmental justice communities. My question is, I've been working on indirect source rules in Colorado, but given that drivers are like 90% men, what kind of messaging can we all collectively come up with to get men to join in this fight? Because I work probably 60, 70, 80%, depends on the coalition, with women. We're concerned about public health, we're concerned about their children, but we have to find a way to break into this dialogue because fleet drivers are men. And I'm just curious if you women up here have any ideas to share with me.
Definitely there are men, and majority are men of color, especially in the Seattle area. So we do have concerns because we have been sitting with them and saying, are you concerned about the transition and what are your thoughts? And yes, they are scared. Number one, they have no idea how the technology works. And also they're scared of running out of jobs, and affordability is an issue. So I will start, as how important this is, centering, like the importance of transition, but also making them give the solutions that they see needed to bring these back to their own communities. In the Seattle area, as I said, is majority is African drivers, so language is very important. Very important how cultural practices are. To also, we have a saying nothing about us should be without us. So it is very important having them sit down, break some bread with them and say, how do you see this solution, this moving forward, bringing back still the income that you need, but also bringing you up to what the technologies are going to be changing and how can you be part of the solutions. That's why I was looking at you in workforce development. That is such an important great jobs, for our youth. It's not easy to understand how to go forward in that pipeline so that is fair for communities that have no access to understanding the great job spot. So I will start right there. Thank you.
I would, my early days of ports and freight, before I started with MFN, sorry y'all, I actually was an organizer on a truck driving campaign with port truck drivers in the New York, New Jersey ports when we were trying to move legislation at that time, and then also dealing with a whole bunch of other issues that were going on. And, I think first and foremost is talking to people. We have members who will be working towards releasing a report that was based on community members talking to their community members who are truck drivers and kind of talking through zero emissions and talking through what that looks like, and remembering that in a lot of ways the drivers are the least resourced, the one that's most necessary to keep all these things moving, right? We don't get our packages without them. We can't find what we need at the stores, produce, all of that. But they have the least amount of power that's being realized, right? We know that organizing does, but there's associations that are acting legislatively on behalf of them. So the same people that are supposed to be defending the drivers are fighting for policies to make it so that English is a requirement for driving, and really trying to unearth the myths and the lies that are being told, and just posing those questions, remembering not everybody is the right messenger for the message too. So sometimes it's not about an organization coming in, but it's community to community. And in order to do that, as Paulina was saying, that takes resources. If drivers and truck drivers are priority, then we need to think about how we're also resourcing them as a priority, how we're resourcing the communities that you're going to have go out. So there's a full cycle to it, and I would
not do at least some organizing, I will say one of the things that we were posing at the ports was a bathroom bill, because on the list of injustices that drivers have, when you're in those long queue lines, you can't pull over. But for the female drivers, that was very different and difficult, and or the female identified, or where, you know, that wasn't as easy to just kind of pull over. So there's a lot of gender issues as well that go in, but I don't want to negate that there are some strong female identified drivers that are out there as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add getting more women into the question as well, like having training programs.
Yes.
So, I think we'll move on to another question. Okay, well, let's see. Well, the top two are both about the economic benefits. So, do policymakers understand the economic benefits of clean air policies? And how do we point out the economic value of better health outcomes, as well as capture some of that value to offset the cost? Okay, so there's a lot of upfront costs. As we know, these electric trucks are really expensive. So how do we kind of bring that conversation together and help perhaps break down that cost? Anyone have any questions?
I have some thoughts that also sort of circle back to your question. So I think educating individuals about their personal health risks associated with these exposures. So men, for example, have the higher risk of cardiovascular disease, which is largely attributable to air pollution exposure, might be a way to get more people involved in protecting their own health. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of companies stand to benefit from, even if they don't realize it, a healthier workforce, especially companies that are self-insured. So, companies that pay for their own health insurance for their own workers want to optimize their health, and I think don't understand the amount of presenteeism, absenteeism, reduced productivity that can be attributed to air pollution exposure, and the tremendous economic costs that are associated with that. So, when there's pushback about making changes at the policy level or the company level, framing the argument in that way and really emphasizing the strength of that association we address.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think communicating that economic benefit is definitely an area where it's important. We have a lot of these conversations, and I think getting that messaging down to the community level and to the policy level is a huge, kind of goes back to what we were talking about, where, who has access to the data, who has access to the messaging, and where does transparent air quality data and research data come from, and who can use it and who understands it. Where are we able to kind of craft or develop a narrative that brings all those people to the table. So I think that's the first place, but also understanding that it's hard to for the folks who do have to pay those upfront costs, for the depot owners and the truck drivers and those associations that do need to pay those upfront costs, giving respect to that. And understanding the bill's going to be large for any project this big, and weighing out those economic benefits, but not negating people's personal experiences with looking at that first cost estimate.
And also acknowledging, we're talking about an industry that's multiple billions of dollars. They have a lot of money, and so Paulina mentioned the permitting process and really thinking through. When a facility comes into a neighborhood, a lot of times with the city for the zoning, they pay one time. They pollute for decades, and they don't have to pay for any of that. There's no additional cost. So the people who are making the profit are continuing to take the profit, while the communities, while the cities all have to deal with, well, what do we do about the infrastructure where roads have been torn up? What do we do about safety issues, and we have to get more safety guards out? What do we do about health and hospitals that are getting full up by things that are preventable diseases? So all of that also comes at really trying to look at where we can leverage power and where we can kind of continue to push. And I think what was said before is set a clear trajectory. This is our goal. We're going to get to 100% zero emissions, and we're going to do it by doing this, and you have to get on board, because that is also something that I think helps to continue to move.
and to really meet the need. But, again, it's a small number of people that have a lot of money that should be paying up for the costs that they're causing for all of us.
It wasn't mentioned, but I think it's related to economic opportunities, incentives for truck drivers. It's very expensive to transition, so how much the city of Seattle actually was working with ICCT too and provided some incentives, but not quite enough yet. Like if a truck is $70,000 to $90,000, providing 20, still very short. So how can we really be meaningful about that and provide more incentives that will be beneficial, especially because all the drivers are low income?
Thank you, and I think making sure the incentives are targeted to those independent owner operators, and as you mentioned, the big companies do tend to have the resources. Yeah, so I think that's probably. I think we need to wrap up. Thank you all so much. This has been really interesting and informative, and I hope that everyone has learned something new. Thank you.
And air quality impacts from urban transport. So we've worked a lot at the local scale with our regional offices around the world, and we've been looking to scale that up to the national level, looking at what things national ministers who control a lot of the money, as a lot of people have mentioned, care about. One of the things they care about is air quality. So we want to look at what is effective at improving air quality and what are the impacts and eventually getting to the costs associated with that, which a lot of people have mentioned. This also is important as development aid seems to be declining in the current political context. So next slide. So air quality, why is it relevant to urban transport? Urban transport, as we heard, a huge source of emissions. Those emissions get into people's lungs, they cause disease and death. We read an estimate that maybe 10% of all urban deaths from air quality deaths from air quality emissions are from urban transport emissions. 400,000 deaths per year, it's a lot. And at least from our analysis, I'm giving away some of the results already, but it looks like some of them are set to grow pretty substantially. So next slide. So this is building on some of our earlier work, looking at a high level. A lot of the discussion earlier was at the very fine-grained scale at specific ports. This is large-scale, country-level analysis. And so we've done this starting in 2014 with a really deep partnership with UC Davis, looking at the national scale, looking at what would happen if we changed how we were working on urban transport, if we changed our policies, if we changed our investments to better urban transport and cleaner urban transport. So we have a number of reports, and this latest work is building on this 6 country-level reports that were released in 2023. So next slide. So our analysis is a what-if analysis. So what would happen if we really changed how we were investing, what policies we were putting into place at the national level. We looked at 4 scenarios. The one is more of the business as usual. It looks at what would happen if we kept doing what we're doing right now. Predicting the future is hard, but we worked with some really smart people, the International Energy Agency, looking at their mobility model, and looking at what they think is going to happen if we keep doing what we're doing. And that's the business as usual on the top left. You don't need to read all the words on the slide. They're more just to illustrate the point. Then on the top right, we have the electrification. So that looks at what if we were really successful at electrifying vehicles? What would that look like? And then we have on the bottom left, which is the shift, which is what would happen if we really were successful at moving people away from private transportation, private cars, towards walking, cycling, public transport. And then on the bottom right is the both. If we were really successful at electrification as well as shifting people away from private transport. And so from that, we then can look at, okay, if we are successful at these things, what would be the impacts in terms of cost, greenhouse gas? That was our original analysis. And then this current analysis is looking at what are the air quality impacts at the local level. So next slide. As I mentioned in the previous slide, this is looking at 6 countries, United States, Mexico, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia. We chose those countries because we have worked in most of those, and they're big, important emitters. So kind of indicative of where things are going in a variety of places. So next slide. We looked at several types of pollutants, and this is not comprehensive, but more to be indicative. So PM 2.5, carbon monoxide, and nitrous oxides. And so those are linked to health impacts. But also we looked at 2 types of emissions, both tailpipe, which is when you burn fuel, it produces emissions that comes out of the tailpipe, and also non-tailpipe, which is emissions that come from other sources, so brake dust, tire wear, road wear, and then dust that's on the road that gets kicked up. And all of those things put particles into the air that people breathe in, and it's bad for you in the same way. So we want to know what is happening that's generating pollutants that are getting into people's lungs. So we tried to do our best at looking at a variety of modes and a variety of pollutants. We didn't get everything. So there's some missing things on nitrous oxide and carbon monoxide. I'll talk about that in a bit. So it's not comprehensive, but we're indicating a direction of where things are going and how the impacts might be. So next slide. So looking at the results for the different scenarios, again, I'll go over them. BAU is business as usual if things continue. So on the very left we have 2015, so that's the start of the analysis period. And then 2050 is the other 4, that's the end of the analysis period. So you can see at the beginning, we have a lot of emissions from nitrous oxides. And so even in the business as usual, we are seeing huge declines in nitrous oxide emissions, even if we're continuing to do what we're doing. And even though we're missing some of the modes, some of the 2-wheelers and minibuses, there's huge growth in car use in that period and also bus use. And so, like, you're still seeing big drops across the 6 countries. And electrification, and if you hit next, you start to hit some circles. Yeah. So the electrification is almost the best of the 2 of shift and electrification. It really got rid of almost all of the emissions. And then, combining the 2 really gets you to the best solution. Next slide, please. Similarly, carbon monoxide, big reductions in the business as usual. Things are going in a good direction generally. And again, though, electrification knocks out most of the emissions from carbon monoxide, even with substantial growth in automobile use, automobile kilometers traveled. So again, it's the electrification and then the combined scenario really is very effective. Okay, next slide. All right, then we get to PM 2.5. Similar scenario, big reductions from electrification, but in the business as usual, it's continuing to climb. It's going up, which is not great. But when you start to pull them together, electrification, and then especially combining it with mode shifting, so moving people out of private vehicles, making those vehicles electric, can really get rid of a lot of the emissions. So if you continue the slides, you can see that. But I really want to point you to the 80 on the y-axis. So if you go to the next slide. I was a little sneaky. The last slide just showed tailpipe emissions. So when you add in non-tailpipe emissions, it changes quite a bit. And things start to look a lot worse. And so in all of the scenarios, except for the combined scenario, the emissions are increasing into the future. Even with heavy electrification, even with just heavy mode shifting, you start to get big increases in PM 2.5 emissions. And it's really only through combining both electrification and mode shifting that you get below what we're experiencing right now in the 6 countries that we analyzed. So it's an interesting finding, we'll talk about the policy implications. So go to the next slide. So we saw a lot of progress. It looks like there's a lot of policies coming into place to reduce, especially some of the emittents that can really have health impacts. Carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides are coming down, and even in the business as usual case. But the non-tailpipe emissions, we're seeing some real challenges in getting those down, and especially for PM 2.5, we still have some challenges as we go forward. Electrification is really important and can really reduce a huge amount of a lot of the emissions, especially from carbon monoxide and nitrous oxides. But really the combined scenario in our analysis really was the strongest. So doing both can really reduce a lot of emissions and really have a big health impacts. So next slide. So we didn't do everything. We didn't tie this directly to the health outcomes and the mortality impacts. We tried to do it. We were working with partners at ICCT. It was really tricky. It's maybe a little bit more sophisticated than we're at yet, but I think it could be really helpful in making this case to policymakers. And then also tying that to the economic benefits of more work on electrification and mode shift can be important. We do some of that work for these scenarios in a forthcoming report, as well as in the existing country level reports. So looking at the specific costs of the scenarios. And we think that's a very helpful message. And as we were hearing from advocates, providing tools for advocacy groups to bring to their decision makers in support of the work that they're trying to do. So we're trying to support our regional offices on the ground, but also partner organizations in their work. And then maybe lastly, clarifying the relative importance of the different emissions would be really important. So what is doing heavy lifting. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you all so much for your attention. Maybe we have just put this report on our website today. We look forward to hearing from you and hearing your thoughts and hopefully partnering to make things better and get this out to the people that need to hear it. Thank you.